Well, on behalf of Professional Partners Education, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn workshop. It's the first for 2023, so that's pretty exciting as well to kick off the year. We started this last year. We started this series in July 2022. It was on the back of all the, call it the non-technical content that we have been creating under the Professional Partners Education brand, which has been fantastic and very, very popular. And now we decided to extend that a little bit. A lot of the firms, a lot of the accounting firms and their team members were talking to us about what more could we learn from a technical point of view, certainly from a VA restructuring perspective, which is what Hall Chadwick is all about. We're one of the top firms in Australia. So we thought we'll start bringing this Lunch and Learn workshop series to life. And so we hope you're going to enjoy the next 30, 35 minutes. If you don't know my name, if you're back or you haven't joined us before, my name is Paul Jans. I'll be your host, and we are here thanks to our beautiful sponsors here. We've got our supporters, Professional Partners Education, Hall Chadwick, Profitmaster Global, iKeep, and Lloyds Auctioneers. Now, big shout out to Danny Morrison. You've been invited here because of Danny's work, or you've come to one of our lunches and you've been extended that invitation to this sort of educational content that we're going to be bringing you throughout 2023 as well. Now, just to backstep again, for everything, if you're on here for the first time, all of the shows we've done, and they were monthly from July last year, everything we've done is on our YouTube channel. So if it's something you want to tap into, it is free content for all of you and your team members. So there is obviously our Lunch and Learn workshops, plus all of the live shows that I did last year on, let's call it the non-technical aspects. So whether it was leadership management, marketing, branding, people, there was a whole series of different content that we did last year. That's all on our YouTube channel. So open up a window, go to YouTube, type in Professional Partners Education, and it will all be there for you. It's all free content. Let's get into today. Let's talk about the topics we're going to go through to start off with. We're going to talk about the types of debtors, number one. We're going to talk through why people may hide. Then our guest will take you through some key things around some case studies around debt collection, as well as asset recovery. And then we're going to talk about helping the accounting professionals understand trade debtors a little bit more. So our topic today is asset recovery. Our two guests, let me introduce you to them. So I mentioned before, if you've joined us and you've just joined us, unfortunately, Michael Partis from Assure Global Plus, his screen can't work, but we've got his audio. So welcome, Michael. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul. Thank you.
That's good. At least we've got the audio, mate. Thank God for that.
And happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day. Yes. We should say that to all the couples out there. Happy Valentine's Day. Let's see there's a lot of love in the air.
And it gives people the afternoon to get their extra bits sorted if they forgot.
Talking about love, let's welcome our resident partner from Hall Chadwick, Richard Croaker. How are you?
Oh, I'm really good, Paul. Great to be back for the new year.
Absolutely. It's
very excited about what we've got lined up.
Yeah, look, it's a funny thing to think that we're already into Feb 14, but you're right. We've got, for all of you that are joining us, we've got obviously our monthly shows. We've got all our content locked in now till June. We start our Empire Masterclass series also next Thursday, where I'll be hosting a very special guest, Darren DeBortelli from DeBortelli Wines, a very, very famous family name here in Australia. So again, if it's something you'd like to register for, jump online and register for that. Gents, let's get into this. We're about 30, 35 minutes from sharing a lot of information with everybody that's online. So, Michael, for those of you that may not know you, let's kick off with a little bit of an introduction of yourself, and then Rich as well. Michael, why don't you go first and tell us a little bit about you at Assure Global?
Well, so I am a bit of an adventurer, let alone anything else. So my claim to fame is I've actually kayaked both the North and South Poles and done a whole heap of other random things in between. There isn't too much of the financial services space that I haven't climbed into over the years. And Assure Global Plus, we are effectively a collections company, a debt recovery company. And that involves both resolving debts that exist and recovering assets where people are reluctant to pay their debts. In a nutshell.
In a nutshell, well said. Rich, what about a little bit about you for firms that don't know who you are?
So, Paul, I like the term the resident partner for the PPE network. But Paul, as you're aware, some of our listeners may be aware as well, that the PPE initiative was actually an initiative brought to Hall Chadwick by Danny Morrison and yourself. And I've had the pleasure of working with you for the last 12 odd months as we've been putting this together. It's been a fantastic ride. It's not only the non-technical stuff, but over the last 12 months, we've had some great technical stuff as well. I remember we had a fantastic conversation on research and development, tax perspective R&D. We also had our senior tax partner, Gina Malaco, came in and talked about some really complex type stuff that's well above my pay grade in relation to tax law. And I think that what we're developing here is really tremendous. And not only am I a partner in Hall Chadwick, but just to keep up with Michael Partis, I've ridden around Australia twice on a motorbike. So I don't know if that qualifies me as an adventurer as well. But I'm also the Chief Executive and President of Profitmaster Global Outsourcing. And I'm also the Chief Executive and President of Hall Chadwick in the Philippines. So not only do I wear a hat here in Australia, but I also wear one in the Philippines as well.
Brilliant. Well said. And thank you for that. Great to have both of you here. And you're right. Some of the key things that we had that's the great thing about these workshops is that we've got the ability to tap into not just Rich, but I know you mentioned Gino then, we've tapped into Kathleen Voris, Gino, we've tapped into Steve Gladman, we've tapped into a number of different partners within our firm to provide that technical aspect, that next layer there that you may not be having. So we certainly hope you enjoy these sessions as we get into 2023. Michael, let's get into it. So let's talk about debtors. Let's chat about the different type of debtors. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, there are three types of debtors as a general rule. But the important thing to understand around when we're talking about debtors is how quickly do people pay? So before I can define what the three types of debtors are, it's really important to understand how quickly does your ability to collect a payment without any sort of assistance happen. So effectively, depending on your debtor days, your credit terms, if you like, for getting your invoice paid, for every time after the second set of debtor days has passed, your trade terms have passed. So if you've got a 7-day cycle at 14 days, your ability to collect it falls by 50% and then falls by half every 7 days after that. So that's 50 years worth of data in our system around that on clients that we've dealt with. And before people have given them to us, we know that on average, every time you're past your average debtor days, you're in trouble. So if your payment terms are 7 days, by 14 days, your chances of collecting it by yourself are 50%. After 3 weeks, 21 days, it's 25%. And it keeps falling by half each time.
Interesting statistics. Rich, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add before I say something there.
No, it's a clear statistic. And I mean, what we see in insolvency, I mean, one of the areas that is a clear cause, I mean, everybody says that it's lack of management, but if you drill down into that, there are more specific causes, and debtor collection is a major contributor of lack of cash flow and leads to bigger problems.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, definitely my background being in coaching as well, chatting to different firms around, call it that lockup, the old lockup, the work in progress in debtors. Obviously, as you mentioned there, it affects cash flow and the ability to grow. I feel like we as an accounting industry have a little bit been left behind there as well. Just my opinion. I think the legal industry have got clever with that by saying, well, throw some money into our trust account before we start any work. I think they've done well to actually move forward with that type of strategy. And sort of what do? Bang, we put $10,000 in a trust account. And then as soon as it gets down to bang, we've got to top it up again for them to continue work. It's an interesting one that our accounting industry hasn't gone any further than that. I wonder how long it will be before, and maybe we're going to have to look back on this one and say, how long is it before they actually start doing things like that?
And that's a really interesting point that I've got a little point for later as we go through it. But when we're starting to talk about the types of debtors, it's a really simple breakdown. There are those who will pay, there are those who are unwilling to pay, and there are those that won't pay. So the trick is, how can you identify won't pays earlier in the process, right? So people who will pay, just as an example, it might be the invoice doesn't meet their accounting standards. Like you haven't given them a purchase order number, you haven't done something, you haven't got the correct entity, you haven't got an ABN on there, right? Like all of those silly type of administrative functions that people don't understand is impacting them because they're too busy with their day-to-day in the business.
Yes.
They might have sent it to the wrong person. And that person doesn't know who to forward it to, so it just disappears, or they leave the business or whatever it is. And so it just sits there unaccounted for. I know that 80% of the work that we do is in that space. People who will pay, but for whatever reason, there's been some administrative issue or financial issue with that invoice that's prevented it from being paid.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, because I know that I've received invoices in the past for certain things, although I've given them account details. Mm-hmm. So it's not worth continuing to follow me up and text me. I'm not the person in charge that can actually make the payment. So it is interesting. So certainly from a clerical administrative point of view, that can be improved. So you've got to get the right data up front.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Good point. Good point.
Those who are unwilling to pay are generally those who are probably holding out for a discount or a better deal. You've supplied that product or service, and now they go, well, if I hold out, you're going to be desperate enough to give me a discount in order to receive that money. So I'm going to be clever and outfox you and decide to sit there and wait until it's sufficiently overdue that you get nervous that I'm not going to pay. And then I'll ask for a discount. They might be stalling to improve their own cash flow. They're waiting for other people to pay them. Or they just might be struggling to meet their obligations across the board, which we're seeing a little bit more of. And as a result, they're giving them their cash to the squeakiest wheel rather than giving it to the person that they should be.
Correct. And that's always been an interesting strategy that we've worked on in terms of making sure that, you know, if your terms are 7 days, as you mentioned before, on the 8th day, it's overdue. So be proactive in making sure that somebody in your business is calling, texting. Nowadays, we've got the ability to, again, everything can be automated. So let's use the automations that are there as a follow-up process.
Yeah. And under the host of reasons why people won't pay, I mean, really what I come down to is I watch for excuse making. They're disputing the quality of or the legitimacy of their work. They're lying about, they lied right up front about their ability to pay and just needed that service done or wanted that service done. Or, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, they skip, they ghost you. And so
yes.
They can no longer be reached.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. It's a good little segue. So let's, apart from all the key things you just mentioned just then, why do people tend to hide?
There's two psychological aspects in play here. One is a shame spiral. And so the shame spiral is where, you know what, I feel bad about the fact that I haven't paid. So I'm feeling pretty horrible. So I'm just going to avoid the issue. And the problem is avoiding the issue, it still nags you when you're sleeping at night. So I try and hide even further or disappear even further, or I try and fob it off to somebody else. And so you've got this spiral that increases and increases about how bad you feel that you haven't met your obligations on. The other component then is really, people talk about it as a grief cycle, but it's more of a change curve. So my circumstances weren't what they were when I started. So instead of me trying to go, rightio, I'm going to admit that particular piece, they get through that denial stage going, oh, holy dooly, I didn't realize I wasn't going to be able to pay. Then they get angry because they go, I can't pay. This is just absolutely no good. And then get quite depressed about the fact that that set of circumstances has evolved. So then what happens in order to try and get themselves out of that cycle, they then turn around and say, well, how about I give you this? And we call it quits. So they start bargaining, right? They're trying to negotiate their way through their own change curve where their circumstances have changed. And now they're trying to rationalize how they can get away with that and still save a little bit of face before they get to the point where they're accepting what they're required to do, how they're required to do it, and are a little more open about what those circumstances are. So we find ourselves as a debt resolution agency, if you like, a debt resolution company, actually being a communication company. What we're trying to do is navigate people through this shame spiral and then this change curve as quickly as possible so that they can actually have a sensible conversation with their creditors or with us about what they need to do in order to move forward so that everyone can make informed and sensible decisions.
Well said. Rich, anything you'd like to add there?
Oh, he's on mute.
On mute. The classic guy, he's on mute. See, 2023.
There you go, technology, huh? Look, it's one of those things that we see as well. I have over a long period of time met with many directors, and that it's an interesting perspective that Michael's created there, which is the idea of the shame spiral. It's just a fantastic description for what people get into. And I'm not talking people who are simply walking away from their debts. These are people who really would love to be able to get their debt paid, but for whatever reason they can't. And it does. You talk to them, they stay awake at night, and sometimes it's worse, and it goes into a shame spiral that you're trying to help them get out of. And whether it's at the debt collection area or more at the insolvency area, it's the same problem for these people. You know, it's an important thing to be able to help people get past.
Yeah, agree. Look, and that's probably where our industry has improved to the point now where, again, if you're using the cloud-based systems that are out there, the engagement letters are created, they're sent, they need to be agreed to before the workflow starts. I feel all those little steps, certainly in our accounting industry, has improved the way that you can do things, and ideally that collection process as well. So even talking to the client about, you know, how would they like to pay? They're things that as an industry we haven't done for a very long time. You know, it's almost like we do the work, and we send out the invoice, and we hope to get paid. You know, again, that's not proactive approach. You know, you can always ask, would you prefer? 80% of our clients prefer that they pay quarterly. So again, it's eased on cash flow. Is that something that you would like? So there's always ways that we can get better in doing those sorts of communications.
I think that shame spiral and change curve also equally applies to the creditor, about making a decision with somebody and giving them terms, and then seeing that those circumstances change for the other person, and then as a result they feel the same way themselves.
Agree.
I agree with that also, that the creditors themselves, they sometimes feel difficulty in reaching out to the debtor. They say, "Oh well, this is embarrassing for me to reach out to the debtor." Yeah.
Now, Michael, I saw a quick note from Rich then. Do you want to try your camera now? Let's see if it works now that we've gone live.
Yeah, I tried that before. Same issue, unfortunately.
Same issue?
Yeah.
That's all right. We'll continue on. I just thought.
Well, it's just adding to the mystery of what debt collectors look like, right? So
that's exactly the strategic move. All right, let's move into some examples, some case study, let's call it. Do you have a case study that you can share with regards to, you know, debt collection? And then we'll go into one about asset recovery as well.
Well, I can probably give you two for each because they're both pretty simple things. I think that they'll touch on the topics that we've got here. So the first one is a case study of a labour hire company. So what we were approached with was an outstanding debtor ledger of about 4.2 million that was averaging 90 days overdue. Right. So somebody had, their issue ultimately was not that they hadn't collected it, they had a significant outstanding ATO debt, and they needed some cash in the door to keep the ATO a little off their back, shall we say. So our job, ironically, there was to collect as much as possible in the 3 weeks before Christmas. So nothing like a little tight time frame, just on the wrong side of the calendar year for anyone to actually be working in some of these places. So the things that we were required to do at that point was sort of identify and resolve their internal data management issues. So their databases were out of date with their contact people. They had stuff sent to the wrong people who no longer worked for the company. So we were chasing stuff off their personal email addresses. So we had to actually locate them to figure out what was sitting in their personal inboxes and then get them to email them in, purchase order resolution, all those sorts of stuff, update their accounting system for them because they didn't know how to use correctly their accounting system. They were a business that was growing at an exponential rate and they couldn't keep up. And so as a result, all of those sorts of technical and compliance issues were pushed to the back. So addressing those and building some systems and training purposes for those, and obviously to collect the outstanding dollars from some significant companies that were throwing up objections that they didn't pay for 120 or 180 days as a standard course. So what became interesting around that is the result that we got at the end of that 3 weeks is we had 1.8 million collected inside that 3 weeks of that 4.2, and we'd reduced the average debtor days down to 75. So this moves back to that point around 80% of issues are administrative, and that companies will pay if you provided them their stuff correctly. And those that were unwilling, we were able to identify early enough that they could decide what they wanted to do, whether they wanted to refer those for further actioning, potentially to people like Richard, or whether they necessarily wanted to turn around and say, okay, we were slow on those processes. They could make more informed decisions around what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
So that was a really positive result of looking at, hey, how do you actually go about collecting cash flow in terms of those sorts of things?
Mate, before you get to your next one, do you want to try your camera again? I just found a little button that I pressed that made you a co-host. Here we go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, hello. Happy days. Well, less happy days now that everyone knows what I look like.
Here we go.
Okay, so on to the next one.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's all right. So the next one is, again, a debt collection one, but this is actually more sort of asset related in terms of those things, where there was a boutique residential construction company that had 46 grand in an outstanding debt for a single client. Now, the issue in that particular instance was the project manager was controlling the flow of funds, and they refused to authorize the final project payment. So the issue there was that the creditor, the person ultimately accountable for it, did not know that there was a problem based on the fact that the project manager was blocking all correspondence going through to the end client. So perfect example of communication issues. So our scope was to collect the full arrears plus any of the associated costs to do with that. And so the activity there was actually a lot to do with reconstructing the correspondence chains, actually understanding what flow of cash had occurred inside that construction project already, and identifying what actually need to occur in order to compel the project manager to agree to get the problem sorted or provide the basis to pursue the creditor. On behalf of our building client, what we were doing was also controlling and liaising with the legal representation to make sure that we were taking the minimum required steps to deliver that outcome and control some costs associated with the collections activity, given that we understood that the creditor, the ultimate sort of debtor, was not aware of what was actually going on. Our result, we did get the full reimbursement plus the costs, and the ultimate debtor ended up pursuing the project manager's PI for reimbursement of the extra expenses that they were involved. And the reason being is, once again, communications business, the project manager was denying access to stuff to prove that they were bigger, stronger, chest beating than us, and didn't want to admit to the mistakes that they made in managing the project.
Very interesting. Rich, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that before we get into some case studies around asset recovery?
Look, I think we're moving on, and I'd look forward to the rest of it. It's very interesting material, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it.
Yeah, good work, mate. Let's go into some asset recovery.
Yeah. Sure. So the first one is a yellow goods hire company. So they own the assets, basically operating leases out to primary producers and things like that. There was a single asset, $890,000. The issue was that the debtor was significantly in arrears on their lease and had hidden the asset. Basically, they moved it to another property that wasn't theirs. So they borrowed somebody else's paddock to stick it in, thinking that we weren't going to be able to come and collect it, which is fair for most of those sorts of things. So our scope was deliver a repossession strategy so that they had something to negotiate with. So we reviewed their contract terms and conditions, which, quite frankly, under any circumstances, whether it's sort of normal debtor ledger stuff or something like this, you should absolutely have a set of terms and conditions. And most of our accountancy clients won't have those in place for their own debtors. Review those contract terms and conditions and identify weaknesses in their repossession clauses. Were there any loopholes there that somebody could exploit in order to deliver an outcome. We provided some advice on the legals around seizing the chattels on a non-consenting property and what those rules look like, especially with the court order processes that were available to us, and then help negotiate the arrears and the termination of the contract. The result ended up being, based on the work that we did, that the arrears were collected in full and the debtor voluntarily surrendered the asset because they understood they were in a corner. So instead of having to actually go through the work, we were able to put them in a position where they saw that their cleverness was not going to necessarily stack up and that it was best for them to make good when they were just trying to be a little cheeky through the process.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Rich, anything else you'd like to add to that, mate? That's
yeah, I would. It's I think this is an area where, as professionals, we need to be very aware of the conditions on which we can actually recover, whether it's recover an asset or recover a debt. And I know our insolvency team are very conscious of how we do those things. And it's not as simple as going and marching in, grab all the assets and away you go. I mean, personal property securities register certainly affects that, but also the attitude of the of who may be third parties in control of the asset and so on. I think that having a professional, whether you're an accountant or an accountant advising a client on a debt issue or a financial difficulty issue, understanding the rules and the environment in which you can work is just so important. And I've had the experience of what Michael's talking about. We were actually trying to recover some assets off a farm up in North Queensland. And, our ability to recover those assets was extremely difficult. And, we had to go through a whole heap of hoops to be able to get it. And this is some years ago. And I think looking back, if we had looked at a recovery strategy from the start, we probably would have got a different result.
very interesting. Excuse me. Very interesting, mate. Actually, just before we go to that, I'm just going to just check in the time. It's 1:30. If anybody online has got any questions you'd like to ask of Richard or Michael, please throw them into the, what are we doing? The Q&A. So if you can put them into the Q&A, that would be fantastic, because I'll come to those in about 2 or 3 minutes as we look to wrap up in about 5 to 10 minutes. Now, Michael, from a point of view of let's call it, this is a little educational sort of piece. So from firms and team members that are watching this, how can you, or what sort of advice could you provide them to helping them understand trade debtors?
Well, there's a couple of things, and I'm going to talk about this specifically from our experience.
Sure.
What we're noticing is that the issue is a lot of new professionals coming into the industry because we're so short of staff. There isn't that experience base. We're taking them all from first and second year graduates who may not have had as much real world business experience as not. And so most of these comments are in that context. Identify clients in your portfolios where their aged receivables are growing, right? So actually have a look and keep an eye on that. The number of accountants I sit down and talk to when we're talking about clients that they're having and they understand that their receivables are growing, but haven't done anything with it. They've sort of noted it and moved on, saying, well, that's obviously the flux of their business. And I think that we need to be a little more proactive in identifying those things. Intangible line items, especially with new professionals, new to industry professionals, intangible line items and P&Ls and balance sheets need some real world context. I think us as experienced professionals, whether that be the senior partners of a firm or not, need to actually reinforce what those mean. Even in a services industry, I think that a growing receivables base is an increasing stack of invoices on a table that haven't been paid. I don't think we take into enough context the lack of experience people have in relation to that, who are new to industry or maybe recently graduated where they haven't had any business world experience before. You were commenting earlier, clients who have difficulty collecting become debtors who have difficulty paying. So if you're identifying stuff in your own portfolio where their things are growing, they're unlikely to be able to pay you as quickly or as regularly as you would like at the same time. And I think that there's a bit of a reinforcing cycle here. And then I think this last point is going to be of more interest to Richard than probably any of the others, to be perfectly honest, is I think that the preference for marketing styles that include business advice in accounting practices these days can become PI issues. Because if a client successfully argues further down the track, they were dependent on their business advisor to act earlier about preventing those particular set of circumstances eventuating, especially if it's related to, say, trade debtors, then that's something that a receiver or a liquidator might pick up to try and drag the accountant into the system at the same time. I mean, you've got misrepresentation issues, you've got all sorts of legal complications around marketing style there, where if a client can successfully argue that they weren't represented correctly by their business advisor, there may be something attractive to somebody further down the track trying to pursue.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'd just step into that if I could. It's a really interesting perspective. The first point I'd like to make is that we actually had our leadership conference for Hall Chadwick in Sydney last week, and it was nice to see you there, Paul. But we had our teams from all over the country come in, and we had a facilitator join us. And one of the things that came out of that, particularly with our managers and our supervisors, is recognising the level of skill that you're able to provide as a consultant. You are the person who can direct questions anywhere in the organisation and beyond. If you don't have the expertise right there, well, you pick it up, and it's part of what Michael does and part of what Hall Chadwick does as well, being that place that you can go to for advice, particularly on insolvency matters. The other thing that Michael was talking about are the risks to professional advisors in relation to advice that they provide their clients. And there's some really interesting material about that and some great case law. And I can remember some of them, but it's a different field that we would be stepping into because it's so broad. But offences under the Corporations Act are not only against directors, they can be against professional advisors. And Michael makes the point that as liquidators, we are looking across a field of vision where we can take opportunities to either recover assets or recover money for our insolvent companies. And unfortunately, professional advisors who don't give the right advice can be right in that field of vision.
Now I had the mute button on just then, so no, it's very, very true. It's an interesting field to, like you said, and I think there was a lot of discussion last week in our national conference around that as well. So good point to raise. Have we missed anything before we look to wrap up? I am looking at questions. There's no questions there. So if you please have one, please drop it into the Q&A bar and we'll quickly come to it. Anything we've missed, Rich? Anything we've missed, Michael?
Mate, I'll just say, I'm looking down the list of participants and it's so lovely to see some people there. I'm not going to mention any names, but you know who you are. And it's lovely to see you guys here. I hope you continue to join us. These things are such an interesting thing. You pick up little snippets along the way, and I've really enjoyed this discussion with Michael. I can only just go back to the very point that Michael was making, that when things arise and you need somebody to chat to and you need good solid advice, well, Hall Chadwick is a good hand to be holding when you need it, particularly in the field of insolvency. And I know Michael's doing some great stuff in debt issues as well, and another great hand to have to hold when you're going through this stuff. It's been a very good discussion.
Yeah, well said. And I think the other key thing is, as we know, with the number of firms we work with, and we try and get this into the mindsets of a lot of the firms we work with early on. You want to actually be proactive in doing something, and if there's an opportunity for a restructure, it's one of the key things that I know the partners talk to me about all the time in terms of getting in early and potentially restructuring, potentially saving those assets, potentially saving the marriage, all these sorts of things. Because if it goes into insolvency, into liquidation, it's too late. So this is probably where the power of the firms that work with their clients that pick up these little issues can turn around and say, yes, okay, guys, let's set up a meeting. Let's chat about this. Let's work through the options. And I think that's some of the great work that we do at Hall Chadwick in the insolvency division.
Very much.
Well done. Okay, it looks like we're good. There's no questions. I agree. There's some great participants. And I know a lot of team members want here as well. And that's the great part about this, over 30, 35 minutes where people are putting it in their boardrooms. If we're too big in your boardroom, we apologize. But this is the great thing about, you know, getting 10 or 20 team members around the board table and they can all learn. So it's fantastic. So Michael, thank you for joining us today. We certainly appreciated you. It's the first time you've been on our Lunch and Learn, and we look forward to having you again. Richard Croaker, it's always great to see you, mate, and good luck with your little trip that you're taking off tomorrow or Thursday?
Thursday. I'm actually away until mid-April, which is a good break. I'm working, but it's not
a break. Yeah, but thanks, guys. Thanks for joining us. To all of you that have joined us, all our firms that we're working with, we hope you enjoyed it. Again, just a little bit of a snippet to what you can start thinking about and the strategies that you can start putting into place. And we certainly look forward to hosting you next time you join us for our Lunch and Work. Like I mentioned, I've got my Empire Masterclass show next Thursday. It's at 12 p.m. Melbourne time because I'm in Melbourne, 11 o'clock for Queensland. Although if you want to jump on board, jump into my LinkedIn, you'll see the links there to register. I'm having a chat to a gentleman by the name of Darren DeBortelli. He's now the third generation of the family as the managing director of DeBortelli Wines, sharing a lot about 95 years in business, what's made them successful, why they've decided to stay family, how do you transfer that knowledge to now the fourth generation coming through. It's going to be a fantastic hour of power. So if you want to join us, please check out my LinkedIn and register for that session. Again, it's over Zoom, so it's free content for all you guys. Rich, thank you. Michael, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Lovely to see you, mate. Look forward to catching up soon.
Happy days.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.